Thank you all for being here. Before we get on with our conversation here, I thought I should also say some things about the book. I think it's an important read. And it's a quick read. It is not a very big book, so I think it's an important read, especially for the younger audiences, I think, who might have missed a lot of the episodes that this book talks about. And what Kapil has pulled off is a very clear recounting of, let's call it the political and some of the socio-cultural high water marks and the deplorable lows that we've had in our country in the history of independent India. When it's provided in a context and we know where the narrative thread is going, it becomes a very interesting read. And sometimes these two, the highs and the lows, are both in the same episode. So, I mean, that kind of brings out the whole complexity of the country that we are, something that I think there is a whole project underway to paint over. So in that sense, also, this book becomes an important read. So what I thought is, instead of just talking about the book more, which I think all of you should end up reading anyways, so we won't spoil that for you, is I'll just kind of pick out some of the moments that are there in the book, and we'll see if Kapil can share more insights or even just recount sections from the book about them. So there are two characters in the book who appear only briefly, very briefly in it. One is in the introduction, and you mentioned your father later as well. And I think Murad and your father's experience, in a way, kind of bring this whole experience together for me. The first question to you would be like, how and where is Murad now?
He's not in India.
Yeah.
And his whereabouts, I don't know, and I don't like to, for obvious reasons that people will understand if you read the book, I don't like to talk about him. And Murad isn't actually his real name. We had to give him a different name in order to protect his identity. There was a review of the book recently in First Post, which said that he had moved to Pakistan, which was staggering, because I didn't mention any of that in the book. He went away to Middle East, like so many Indians do, to work there. And his departure from India was rather tragic, because he was very much wedded to the idea of India, but he felt that he did not belong in India because of his experience with India. He was shattered from within, and therefore he had to leave the country. And that I recounted that story because that story could only have happened in the India I grew up, and many of us would recognize. An India in which we almost rejoice in each other's cultures and learn from each other. That India gradually became, very gradually, but very almost imperceptibly, but at the same time very perceptibly, became a different kind of place, while we were distracted by the glitz of liberalization. We lost in the process something that we didn't quite realize until we'd already lost it. And the loss of that India is recounted in the prologue.
Yes.
And Murad is obviously the victim of that transformation of India.
Yes. I mean, the reason I brought up Murad is because, and there are no spoilers here, because that's in the prologue itself, is because I think it kind of underpins how much things have changed. And just for the audience here, because when I reached that section, I was like kind of stumped for a while. Maybe I don't know enough about the rest of India. Maybe this is a Muslim name, I thought. Because Kapil went to a madrasa. Your father put you in a madrasa, right? And I was wondering why this is happening. And that's in Hyderabad.
Yeah.
And I was wondering why this was happening until, of course, he tells us that because his father wanted him to experience the other India as well, and very strong secular credentials and stuff like that. And it is, you talk about a time that does not exist anymore.
Yeah.
Because his madrasa the madrasa would begin with a rendition of Sare Jahan Se Acha.
Yeah.
And you also come to learn that he ended up celebrating his first Diwali ever, because his father had a problem with the pretension of the money being blown up at Diwali. And he celebrated his first Diwali in a mosque with something that Murad put together. So, I mean, that in a way kind of is right in your face, that this is what we were at one time and look where we have arrived. So how was that personal journey for you? I mean, in the book we see how India transitioned, right? But as you came to terms, or not terms, why should you come to terms with it? But as these realities became real, like really obvious to you, Murad's experience, stuff like that. How was that?
Well,
like?
my experience is you've said something very interesting there about the Diwali being celebrated there, because I grew up in a rather weird family in that we didn't really celebrate Diwali because my father thought it was very vulgar in a poor country to go and burn money. And so we never celebrated Diwali. When I told this to my friend, my Muslim friend with whom I grew up, he smuggled fireworks into the school and we had our first Diwali in the courtyard of a mosque. That episode seemed so ordinary to me at the time while we were doing it. But years later, it acquired a special significance because years later, while I was traveling in India, when I moved to North India, then I moved to England, came back, traveled around, there were things being said about Muslims that when I was growing up, people would not say out of decency. Yeah. Now people would say all sorts of things, they meet, they're unclean, they don't wash, all sorts of things. That I didn't know when I was growing up. And it's precisely to protect myself against this kind of prejudice that my parents sent me to a madrasa. So I could, as a relatively well-to-do liberal, I could find that kind of attitude among Indians of my background deplorable. But Murad had to experience it in a completely different way. For him, it wasn't a remark made by someone. For him, it was, being picked up randomly and being, tortured, as I write in the book. So our attitudes are often just attitudes. And for people against whom those attitudes are formed, they end up having a very different, those attitudes are expressed in a different way. They express themselves in the flesh of those people. His whole body was shattered. He was, our souls are offended. His flesh was tormented. So that is the difference between how I experienced the transformation of India and the way he experienced the transformation of India.
Yeah. And that's quite... Murad's experience is really disturbing, and I think it kind of explains a lot of things. This is... but there's this quick anecdote that I'd like to share with you about, which adds to this whole narrative is, we have a friend who looks after our advertisements from Calcutta.
Yeah. A
Muslim guy. And he's very hardworking in everything. He's got newspapers in Bangladesh. He can even collect an ad for an RSS publication without problems. Very professional. And he's got a younger brother who's always been a troublemaker. So the family put money together and sent him to Canada or something. They were always they were not sure of what this guy would be up to. And then they started receiving phone calls from him. And it would show as an Indian number, right? When they receive a call from the son claiming to be in Canada. This was the time, remember all those fake, they had opened these telephone exchanges through which calls would be routed by Reliance and all these guys to avoid paying taxes. And the first reaction of the family was, this guy has not gone to Calcutta, he's joined some cell and he's going to create trouble. So, that's how much it has been internalized. This actually had a happy ending, but not others so much. But that's all in the prologue, right? Yeah. And the rest of the book, of course, he does not intrude on you, right? Kapil is not there saying, I saw this, I saw this, I saw this. It's a recounting of the history and written brilliantly. I must congratulate you on that, commend you on that. It's very readable, it's very important. And you keep out of it to the extent that you provide the context, I think, which is very important. And just like we, in the previous question, were talking about how much things have changed, they have not really changed that much either in some other context, because I was reading this section where, we'll get to that later, but the liberalization of Manmohan Singh and how that is celebrated so much. But what Manmohan Singh did for the corporates and to the banks, Indira had already done it for Sanjay, right? It was one guy who played that role. And we only hear very vague references to Sanjay. We'll get into the other monstrosity shortly, but this whole indulgence of using the institutions, where did you kind of bring those stories in from? And why do you think it's important for the readers to know not just of the emergency, but what led to it?
This book actually began with as a project to write about India's transformation under the incumbent Prime Minister, Modi. And lots of people were saying to me that Modi is unprecedented. He's going to transform India in ways we haven't witnessed before. And I was looking back, and one of the first books I read was a book by Vinod Mehta called The Sanjay Story.
Okay.
And I was 13 when I read it, and it stayed with me. What happened then was India was a republic founded upon institutions. It could survive as a democracy only if those institutions were enhanced and strengthened. Congress Party was one of the most important institutions of this country. And the party was first made into a personal property of a family. And that great institution lost whatever credibility it had at that point. It remained in power because it was the party that led India to freedom. And within that party, the family effectively having taken over, the mother and son began to run the show. So Indira Gandhi was disqualified as a member of parliament by the High Court of Allahabad, and she had to step down. And the party had already been destroyed from within. Sanjay showed up and said, "Mummy, you can't step down. The only way you can stay in power is to suspend the constitution." That very morning in 1975, they got a copy of the constitution from Parliament's library.
Yes.
And she invited her advisors from Calcutta. They flew in and they drafted emergency orders. They took it to the president, Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed, and he signed it he didn't demur. And that's something we've witnessed happen again very recently with the abrogation of 370. The president just signed it. That very night, electricity was cut off to newspapers such as yours. Opposition was put in jail. Press was censored the next morning. And India woke up. Indians who had taken democracy for granted. There were rumors that had gone up in Delhi that Indira Gandhi might suspend the constitution, but the opposition said, "This is India. This is not, this is not the Philippines. That's never going to happen in India. We're a great democracy." Indians had this attitude of thinking we are so special. And the next morning they woke up and India was a dictatorship. Gone. Habeas corpus was suspended. You could be picked up from anywhere and your family couldn't file a writ in the court to ask where your body was. You disappeared. And the Solicitor General of India said on the floor of a courtroom that Indians are not entitled to liberty or freedom. No Indian has the right to liberty or freedom. And he said that in earnest. And Sanjay was a deranged man. He was a man who had ideas about how to fix India, quote unquote. And he would wake up in the morning and he'd say, "Why do we have so many slums? We need to make Delhi look beautiful." So he would give orders to his minions to basically raise the slums. But those slums contained human beings. What are you going to do with those human beings? So they would be piled into a truck and then disgorged outside the Jamuna River. So these slums came up in Delhi, other slums outside the city. He decided that India is overpopulated, so he started these find and operate missions. 6.2 million Indians were surgically mutilated to stop them from reproducing. These were called sterilization drives. That is 15 times the number of people sterilized by Hitler's Nazi regime. And we were a democracy. We were, in theory, a democracy. The only people who applauded Sanjay Gandhi was the World Bank. Because, the economy had some prospect of growing then. And India became the strange place where we were celebrated as an exemplar because we had fought off the British through non-violent means, and yet we were a hellish place. Teachers, in order to get their pay, had to produce sterilization certificates. You were given targets. You had to bring at least 3 people to be sterilized. So they found beggars on the streets, brought them, and their manhood was chopped off, figuratively speaking.
Yes.
And this is how India functioned for 21 months. And Indira Gandhi called the election for one reason only. People say it was out of some residual allegiance to democratic ideals in her Nehruvian blood. That's not true. She called the election because her intelligence officers assured her that she was going to win the elections. And all the intellectuals of India, the top intellectuals of India at the time, rather than oppose Indira Gandhi, rationalized her dictatorship. They said, these poor people, they don't need the vote. They don't know what democracy is. Democracy is for rich countries. We're a poor country. We need, a bit of tyranny. Khushwant Singh, Rusi Karanjia, they all did that. And it was the people of India, the neglected masses of India, the ordinary men and women who'd been brutalized. They threw her out of power. She lost her own seat. Her son lost his deposit.
Which is what I was thinking about this whole episode also, because, we'll get back to the emergency and sterilization as well. It's like she got voted out of office. She lost, yes. But it's not as if the opposition was given this clear mandate on an overwhelming majority that government couldn't last. It was this ragtag collection. So what do you think kind of explains that?
I think that government didn't last because, first of all, who was going to be the prime minister in that? There was some competition between Morarji Desai and his rivals, and that government was a formation. It was an ideological kaleidoscope. There were Hindu nationalists in it, there were communists in it, there were capitalists in it, there were socialists in it. It could not last because there were so many internal fractures within that. And more importantly, these people didn't know how to hold power. They were people who just came into power without knowing how to wield it. And Indira Gandhi was very, very brilliant at wielding power. And when she was out of power, she was so good at organizing herself, mobilizing people, claiming to be the victim, invoking the memory of independence movement. And these people felt, even though they were in power, they tried to start an inquiry, they paraded her in public and tried to humiliate her. That actually worked to her advantage. What they could have done is, gone about governing India. But the most interesting thing is they did exactly what Indira Gandhi did. They invoked the provisions of emergency within the constitution to suspend Congress governments across the state. So they were no different from her.
Yeah.
This is the thing about democracies. It takes so long to build institutions, but once you corrupt them, once you give people that example, others will follow. They will destroy what you've already begun destroying.
Yes. The emergency is an interesting episode because one of the things that I've believed for a long time is, I'm bringing it back to the Sikkim context, is that if Sikkim had held out for even a month, maybe the merger would not have happened because the merger happens in May and the emergency happens in June.
Yeah.
So if emergency had happened and Sikkim had still not merged, India would be too busy with so many other things that maybe the merger itself would not have happened. And interestingly, the first birthday, Indira Gandhi spent her first birthday during the emergency in Sikkim.
There you go.
She was here with both her sons. I didn't know that. Both her sons were here for her birthday, and Sanjay Gandhi, and we'll get back to the sterilization now. And Sanjay Gandhi arrives here, and he sees that Sikkim is not doing enough for his grand sterilization campaign. And he called up the officers who happened to be a raw official who's written a book.
Yeah, he's just published a book.
No, sometime back, Open Secrets or whatever. And he said, this officer has called up and said, what are you doing? Like, this sterilization program is such a big program all over the country. Why is Sikkim not doing enough? And he, for whatever reason, I don't know who stood up to Sanjay Gandhi. He didn't really stand up, but he kind of tried to argue that Sikkim already has such a small population. The lecturers technically call themselves the vanishing tribe. Yeah. We can't possibly have sterilization here. And he was very upset. So he brought together a whole lot of local youth, brought them into the youth congress or something that he used to head at that time, and tried to push through the whole sterilization campaign.
In Sikkim?
In Sikkim, yeah. I don't think it really happened. Which is the other thing about this whole sterilization thing, right? 6.2 million people is like a huge number.
Yeah.
We've read bits about it, and it is still a horror, Nasbandi as it used to be at that time, right? It's such a big horror. I think it technically should have scarred an entire generation.
Yeah.
But did you actually meet anyone who was a victim of this thing? I've never really heard of people coming saying, like, I was picked up and this happened to me. Or we don't know how many of them were actually forced, like what you mentioned, the beggars picked up from the streets or laborers just collected and taken to wherever. And
so there are two. So I have not personally met anyone who was subjected to sterilization, and the reasons could be multifarious. They could have been. They picked up any man, any male with working equipment was picked up. But I've read very closely and seen documentary evidence of the terror. The reign of terror, especially in northern India. So in Punjab, men basically moved into their farms because these vehicles would arrive at night to grab people. In other parts of India, police squads would arrive at bus stops and just randomly pick up men and take them away in some parts because they were given find and operate missions. Every administration had to provide numbers and show evidence to Sanjay Gandhi because he wanted numbers. He was a man who got things done. And in one place, they picked up an old man, and he died. And they picked up Dalit men. A lot of the Dalit men were picked up. And in one Muslim village, the superintendent of police went there, and he threatened to fuck their mothers, quote unquote, if they didn't accept. And he said, I'm going to bomb the entire village. And he just spent the day working his way through the men of that village. And what is remarkable about what was happening then is that the horror, the full scale of it, only became apparent after the nightmare. People felt it, people knew it, but the widespread awareness wasn't there because the press was so heavily censored.
Mm-hmm.
And South India wasn't scarred by that. So in many parts of South India, they didn't know that the emergency was actually happening. So there was an American journalist called J. Anthony Lucas who traveled through India, and he said when you got to Chennai, people didn't really, they loved Indira Gandhi. They didn't know that this was happening, and Indira Gandhi didn't really see the South as a threat. She saw the South as being relatively more sophisticated. All they cared about, their principal sensitivity was to the language issue. And they loved the Congress Party anyway. To this day, it remains the bastion of the Congress. So it was the North that was so deeply scarred by it. And the reason I think it wasn't so well known at the time is because the press was massively censored. It was only afterwards. But they managed to rationalize it afterwards. And as soon as the Janata government came into power, rather than documenting the horrors of Indira Gandhi, rather than making people aware of them, they tried to pin it on her, parade her, try to basically accuse her of corruption. They were not very skilled at using the organs of government to punish her in a way that would strengthen democracy. All they wanted to do was basically entrench themselves in power. And in a bid to do that, they actually lost power.
Yeah, I mean, I've always wondered, because, I mean, we read about there's some recent books. There was some big anniversary of the emergency that came out.
Gyan Prakash wrote a great book about it. Yeah.
Books came out and stuff like that, but really not enough.
No.
Not enough.
I mean, this kind of episode anywhere else there would be a museum to it. This would be like Franco's rule in Spain,
Yes.
But we didn't talk about it. To us, I write about in the book that there are hundreds and hundreds of schemes named after Indira Gandhi. Despite that, there is a national park in Bombay named after Sanjay Gandhi.
Yes.
After that,
yes.
There must be at least 200 or 300 national government schemes named after a man who was really a thug.
Yes. Yes. Which kind of it was kind of messed up what happened in that decade, because in a way this paramountcy of the Gandhi family over the Congress is, of course, we saw that with Indira Gandhi's elevation and her splitting the whole party and things like that. But it's in 1980 that it kind of gets reinforced as well, right? After Sanjay Gandhi died, and Rajiv is just plucked out and made the Congress president, and
by the evening.
By the evening, yes. But what we also kind of don't get enough of, and which is why this book is so. And like most readers, while they're going through this book, will, like, in the initial sections, will think that he's kind of being very soft on Modi, because then you have to wait till part 2 comes about, right? But in the initial section, like, so no one is really spared. And I think I now get your point about that it is not just Modi who did all this, right?
Yeah.
This experiment has been underway for a while. So when I was growing up, for instance, I remember I was, I think, quite young in school at that time, and Rajiv Gandhi became the prime minister, and the first Asiads happened, and you had these newsreels before the movies, this film division color newsreels about the hockey matches. It was brilliant, right? On AstroTurf for the first time, we were seeing these things happen, and there was this whole celebration of color TVs having arrived and things like that happened, right? Which is kind of the memory that most of the stuff that has come out since then, recounting that time, is this really nice guy. He might have been a nice guy in private, but this Sanjay Gandhi, before him, Indira and Rajiv nexus, which has really not been blamed enough for a lot of the ills that we see today. Because I was thinking that everyone blames. I think it's a blame. Everyone blames UPA too for Modi having arrived, right? What they are completely missing in saying that is that this was seeded in 1980s, right?
Yeah.
With Rajiv Gandhi, Sanjay, Indira, and their plans of sub-nationalism. I mean, this whole sub-nationalism that has become such a big issue in our country, and the rise of the Hindu right. They gave the fodder for the Hindu right to kind of really come about. So, what explains this disconnectedness? I mean, why are we now a generation that has no clue of... Too many people really think that UPA 2 was such a failure, which it was, right? that is what led to Modi.
No, I think
it is
what
not
happened-
really that.
No, it's not. Modi himself was formed, his politics were formed in opposition to the emergency. He, obviously he has his ideological baggage, he's an RSS man, but the betrayal of the emergency created a lot of people who could never look at Congress again as this great moral force. Do you guys remember George Fernandez? He was the defense minister of India, a socialist, nothing like Modi. And yet he joined the BJP, his party, Samatha Party, joined the BJP, and he became a coalition minister and a defense minister. And there was a great video of him that was doing the rounds when he died. He goes to he goes somewhere and he has Sonia Gandhi's picture removed. The reason people of that generation were so passionately anti-Congress is because they had Congress ceased to be Nehru's Congress for them. Similarly, the people who now voted Modi, who now are passionately pro-Modi, view Congress as a morally bankrupt party, view Congress as a vehicle of corruption, especially UPA 2, as you talked about. Some of that was obviously exaggerated by the media, which was very pro-Modi. But the failures of UPA 2 were staggering. Administrative failures, management failures, media management failures, and Manmohan Singh being put in office. The project of a country making the kind of metamorphosis we witnessed in 2014, switching from UPA to Modi, is a project of a generation. Jairam Ramesh, when I was doing the event with him in IIC, he said Modi's rise can only be explained by what happened in UPA 2. That's not true at all. Modi was a hero in South India. He went to Chennai and people received him as a hero. In 2007, he was seen as a decisive figure. And people were craving for a man like him as early as 2009. And they were craving a man like him because they welcome the kind of vision he was offering. Do you remember Mukesh Ambani, Anil Ambani, and all the industrialists were making that, going to Gujarat and saying, he's the lamp, he's the light, he's the hope of the nation. This was long before 2014.
Yes.
So the project of making Modi, by the time a country like India, which was founded on the values of secularism and inclusiveness, becomes ready for a man like Modi, is a long transformation. It takes a long time, and it takes the number of betrayals, the accumulated betrayals I've described in the book. It can't just happen overnight. And there will be a reaction to Modi at some point. We'll get to that later.
Yes. This, because you have this interesting observation as well, so I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on that. You mentioned India's failure to be honest about its history allowed the Hindu right to weaponize it.
Yeah.
Like, if you could tell us, like, what.
Right. Okay. So I
think that's another thing we kind of sidestep.
Yeah, we sidestep that. That one we sidestep so massively, and I read history, Indian history here, and then I read it in England, and I was so poorly equipped about what our history was, especially the arrival of Islam in India. So we used to grow up, because I had this madrasa upbringing and everything, we'd say, this great Indian actor Raza Murad once said, when we say Hum Hindustani, we mean Hum is Hindu and Muslim and in between everything else.
Okay.
And I found that so beautiful, and I held on to that for many years. And yet many people had internalized this trauma, passed on from generation to generation, about there was some memory that wasn't finding resolution. So I went to a place called Warangal in southern India, where there were these beautiful 11th century medieval temples. They were wrecked, but the faces of all the statues had been defaced. This happened because Alauddin Khilji sent his troops, and iconoclasm is one of the tenets of Islam. And you look at the arrival of Islam, especially in northern India, and its spread. It is accompanied. It ought not to be a controversial statement to make, with extraordinary violence. And the people who were exposed to that violence didn't experience the arrival as some sort of like a tourist van arriving with people saying, "Hi, I brought some gifts with me." They experienced it as a calamity. And our textbooks didn't really prepare us for that. We could go to school, come out, and not know the full extent of the horrors that ravaged medieval India. Medieval India was a pretty horrible place, where an entire culture that had developed over centuries was in many places razed. And for instance, the Babri Masjid, the quest for to build a temple there, is very much tied up to this grievance Hindus have that a wrong was done to them and a historical wrong must be righted. And I feel that desire to take revenge against history can only be dealt with by teaching people what actually happened in history. When we paper over it, I cite a book by Rumila Thapar, in which she says that the arrival of Islam had made no transformation in India's culture. It was all wonderful. And she talks about Ghazni from Afghanistan. She says he smashed a few temples in India, but he built a beautiful library in Afghanistan. How does one mitigate the other? And until we accept that fact, V.S. Naipaul had a wonderful phrase. He said, "You must accept that the past is dead, or the past will kill." We must acknowledge history. We must say that, listen, violence happens in many places. When the French came to England, it was violent. When the British came to India, it was violent. When Islam, Central Asians, made a thrust into India, it was violent. But the answer to that violence is not to go and pick up and kill random Muslims on the street. It's to accept that and move on from it. And until such time as we refuse to accept that, in deference to some kind of, liberal politeness,
more condescending then.
It's extremely condescending, and it's profoundly self-wounding. We have harmed our own secular project. And just treat me as an adult and tell me what actually happened there.
Yeah, and I guess if you don't do that, then you're left with what you also mentioned in your book, the new history books which tell you that Rana Pratap actually defeated Akbar.
Exactly. You get the stuff where, we put a man on Mars 4,000 years ago.
Yeah.
We come up with pseudo-history. We say things like the Mughal Empire never really existed.
It's completely wiped. Actually not existing in the Maharashtra textbooks.
Exactly. It's been wiped out of there. And in Rajasthan, they say that, as you said, that, the Rajputs actually defeated the Mughals.
But do you realize, Maharana Pratap ceases to be a hero if he wins. It's his loss that makes him such a star. Right?
His sacrifices,
Yes. So we are still in the kind of pre-Modi era here. But I also really like the section on Narasimha Rao.
Yeah.
Because I think he's another character, another politician who does not get his due.
Yeah, he doesn't.
And I guess that's because our obsession with just binaries, right? Was it good, bad, useless? The only memory that most people have of that time is that this guy slept when Babri was demolished, or he would doze off in meetings and was useless. Which is, I don't know how people buy that, because he actually ran a coalition government and they completed a term. So I think that section is very nuanced and layered, despite it being so short. And what is also wonderful is that Manmohan finally gets called out in this book for what you call a subcontinental Pinochet, that he was. So it would be nice if you could just kind of get into that a bit as well, because I think Sikkim, all of Sikkim's problems with hydel projects and things like that are thanks to what he did, right? So if you could kind of get into that a bit about
PV as well, or just
PV as well.
So about PV Narasimha Rao,
he's fascinating. Really.
Yeah, he's a very fascinating man. He spoke. So there's this little anecdote I write about in the book. He was Indira Gandhi's foreign minister.
Yes, that one is.
Yeah, and he was in Cuba, and she wanted him to persuade the non-aligned movement to move their next meeting from Baghdad to Delhi. So he spoke to the Iraqis in Arabic, he spoke to the Iranians in Persian, spoke to the Cubans in Spanish, the African nations in French, and he spoke to the Pakistanis in Urdu. And by the end of it, he charmed them all to the extent that they all voted unanimously to move it to Delhi. He spoke 13 languages. And he
wrote quite many of them as well.
Wrote a lot of short stories, wrote novels, translated a Marathi novel into Telugu, a Telugu novel into Hindi, and he did that all before he turned 30. And he was a freedom fighter in Nizam's Hyderabad. This man is so extraordinary that in '92 he was nominated alongside Deng Xiaoping as the Man of the Year, the year worldwide. For a man like that to be written out of history in India as though he didn't exist. If you look at Congress's literature and its posters, there is Rajiv Gandhi, there is Sonia Gandhi, there is Manmohan Singh. It's like there is a gap where this man just ceases to exist.
The Mughal period in the Maharashtra history textbooks.
Do you remember that, in Stalin's Russia, his portrait would remain with his friends, but every year one person would be erased. And it was like that. Manmohan Singh PV Narasimha Rao was completely erased. And he was an extraordinary man. I don't say this because a lot of reviewers have said that I'm sympathetic to him because he's from my state. I have absolutely no allegiance to him because he's from my state. He just struck me as a very fascinating figure. And you mentioned something about how he held together a minority government for 5 years, being a non-Gandhi. And he was chosen because he was seen as a pliant, weak man who would step aside. Instead, he actually stayed in power, was quite ruthless when he needed to be, and he opened up the economy because he was a very practical sort of man. He decided that socialism is just not going to work now. And in order to do that, he got Manmohan Singh, who was he was at the University Grants Commission. He was a chairman then of University Grants Commission, and he rang him in the morning and he said, show up at Rashtrapati Bhavan in the afternoon and I'm going to make you finance minister. He did it. And Manmohan Singh, along with the World Bank and the IMF, drafted an austerity budget, which basically meant opening up the economy to foreign investors and cutting subsidies to the people who most needed, farmers and other industries, local, indigenous industries. And P.V. Narasimha Rao decided that this was essential to ensure India did not go bankrupt. He did that. For him, it was a remedy. For Manmohan Singh, it was an ideology. For Manmohan Singh, this was religion. Manmohan Singh was doing something he thought had to be done. For him, it was axiomatic. He believed that India had to be a free market capitalist economy, open itself up completely. And in '92, when he delivered his first speech as finance minister, he made a promise to the people of India. He said, I will never take any action that will harm the poor of my country. He made that solemn pledge. And then when he became prime minister, he proceeded to preside over something called Operation Green Hunt. You've heard of this?
Yes.
In which the tribals in central India, in Chhattisgarh, the poorest people, were exposed to the most sophisticated weaponry because they would dissent from his vision of what India should be. When people protested, he went to Washington in 2009, and he was welcomed by Barack Obama as a great Democrat. And these two men said, "We are democratic allies." Meanwhile, in Chhattisgarh, people were being beaten up, shot, brutalized, put into pens, and killed by this ex-legal force called Salva Judant, because they dissented. They wanted to hold on to their land. How can you reconcile this man's image? Manmohan Singh never won an election, just so you know. He was made prime minister. Yeah. He never in his life won an election. This man was given the safest seat in Delhi, South Delhi. This man was given the safest seat in South Delhi, and he was endorsed by industrialists. He was endorsed by film stars, editors, and it was such a safe Congress seat. He made history by losing it. Manmohan Singh never won election as a councillor, as a dog catcher. He never won election to anything. And it was the hubris of the ruling family, the dynasty in Congress, that they made him prime minister. And once you become prime minister, you basically never have an avenue to interact with people. He didn't have to get elected to Lok Sabha. He was in Rajya Sabha for 2 terms. And he just came up with a stream of policies that were affecting people. And he never, within his cabinet, nobody respected him. That's why there was so much corruption, because they knew that he was not the actual holder of power. And he was this strange, clownish figure seen as a great intellectual with tremendous gravitas, but within his cabinet he was disrespected. And all the pent-up rage in him, I felt he took it out on the most defenseless people of India. I know people don't like to see him that way, but God, when you look at the things he did... I mean, 2008, our biggest city, Bombay, was attacked by terrorists from Pakistan who were on cocaine and, went about slaughtering human beings for 24 hours. And Manmohan Singh couldn't even get the chief of the ISI to fly to Delhi. He rang them up. First, he puffed his puny chest in their direction and said, "Send your chief to Delhi." And they said no. And he said, "All right, I'll forget about it." And the first anniversary of 26/11, he was in Washington. When you're so weak, of course, Modi will claim to be strong. Yeah. And you know what he did? There was a Kashmiri man who'd been arrested for being part of this elaborate plot to bomb Parliament in 2001. He gave orders to hang him. He had him hanged. Yeah. So we killed an Indian citizen, a Kashmiri man, and by doing that, Manmohan Singh alienated more Kashmiris. while he did nothing to Pakistan, which actually exported
Yes.
terror to India.
Yes.
And this, more than anyone else, in my view, he was the worst prime minister of India.
Yes.
And the fact that he was a prime minister of India is an affront to this nation. You should win an election. Procedurally,
Yeah.
you're not required to, but really, morally, to wield that much of power without ever having yourself ratified by the electorate
And
is
especially
extraordinary.
since he was never really in touch with the people.
Never
not
in
through
touch
his
with people.
professional career.
His
or
entire
anything.
life, he was a
Yes.
theoretician. He lived
Exactly.
his entire life without knowing what the people actually wanted, while claiming to be an expert on what they needed.
So yeah, I mean that was nice to be called out. I mean Manmohan to be called out for that, because there's this other episode that you talk about when I think some world leaders are gathering in Delhi,
Yeah.
and the farmers are marching there with a protest. So the farmer protests are of some vintage, the
This
same
is
kind
the
of farmer
land rights
protest that we
protest,
see.
yeah.
Yes, and it's Manmohan Singh, right?
Manmohan
Who just
Singh.
kind of stops them at the borders and
No, Manmohan Singh puts them in an enclosure in Delhi. This is the largest protest in India's history for land. And all of you know the heat of Delhi, what it's like if you've been to Delhi. And he's welcoming Angela Merkel to Delhi, and they're going to sit and discuss what a great, rising India. And it was a conference on India's rise, I think. And these hundreds of thousands of farmers have marched from rural India over days to Delhi, and he has them locked up in an enclosure, open air enclosure in Delhi, in the heat of Delhi, without access to toilet or clean water. What kind of you have to be, your reserves of empathy need to have been completely depleted to do that and still say that I'm working for the betterment of the people. I know what's good for you, you don't.
I remember this time. I don't know. Maybe I just saw that. But the time when I completely lost all respect for
Yeah.
Manmohan Singh, right, was it George Bush right?
Yeah.
Is
Showed up in India.
Yeah, showed up in India for the state dinner, and I can swear I thought when George Bush hugged Manmohan Singh, he was blushing,
Oh yeah.
and I said like, "ये बहुत बेइज्जती हो गया यार." I mean, this is like really too much. I mean, that kind
He
of
said, Mr. President, the people of India love you.
yeah, something on those lines. Because what you also mentioned in the book is that, and which is interesting, because that is also not something that is talked enough, is that Manmohan Singh delivered millions of people under Manmohan Singh. Millions
Yeah.
of people moved out of dire poverty
Yeah.
and into barely tolerable destitution.
Yeah.
And this is something that we experienced in Sikkim also, where suddenly within a year, the number of BPL families just dropped.
Yeah.
And which is when they just redefined what poverty means.
Shall I read you that section?
Oh, yeah, that'll be
I
nice,
think
yeah.
that section is actually, you've just put your finger on something very interesting people don't talk about. I'll just read out this one section. The free rein Singh allowed capital is today credited with lifting millions of people out of poverty. A more accurate description would be that millions of people moved out of dire poverty and into barely tolerable destitution. Viewed in isolation, this is an achievement that justifies every plaudit that is tossed at Singh. Seen in conjunction with the wealth accumulated during Singh's premiership by the top 1%, it is an indictment of his trickle-down economics. So much was generated at the top. India became a $1 trillion economy in 2007, added 42,000 new members to its ranks of dollar millionaires in 2009, and was home to 8 of the world's richest people in 2010. Yet so little seeped down. More than 400 million Indians lived below the international poverty line in 2010, and 46% of all children were malnourished in 2011. In one of his last public speeches, P.V. Narasimha Rao, the man who had plucked Singh out of bureaucratic obscurity, offered a public atonement by bewailing his successor's rush to sell national assets and counseled Indians that trickle-down economics does not work. Unable to eradicate poverty, Singh's regime attempted to redefine poverty. In 2012, Singh's planning commissioner, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, pegged the poverty line at 32 rupees a day. Anyone earning more than 32 rupees was not poor. Asked if he could survive on 32 rupees a day, Ahluwalia said, "I can't."
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's a kind of a nice place to move into section 2 now
Yeah.
of your book. And before we get into that era, you've been kind of, one of the groups that I think you are unapologetically critical of is, I think, the RSS. I mean, it only finds one mention there. But I found that really interesting, that you're not very kind to RSS, where you say Modi drained his youth propagandizing for the RSS. was there more in that you meant? I mean, not just using up his years for the RSS, but also getting kind of, what kind of an influence do you think RSS has been?
RSS completely. So Modi went to RSS camps as a young man, and RSS was founded by Hedgewar, a doctor from Andhra, who moved to Maharashtra to escape persecution at the hands of the Muslim ruler of Hyderabad, the Nizam of Hyderabad. And RSS is steeped in two paradoxical ideas. One is empowering Indians by making them respectful of their culture, reminding them who they are. But the reason they feel it's necessary for Indians to remember who they are and to be powerful is because they feel Indians are eternal victims. We've been destroyed by British, by Europeans, by Muslims before that. So there's almost this urge to seek revenge against history. And Modi internalized that to such an extent that he spent his youth, he left his wife, to whom he was married at a young age. He left his own mother, whose mother was very devoted to him, he was very devoted to her. And she only makes an appearance after Modi becomes a prime ministerial candidate, because he says,
he still spent his birthdays with her.
Yeah, I brought him a crocodile, she said, put it back, you've separated the crocodile from her mother. All those stories that come out later. He sort of readjusts. He does a lot of retrospective readjustment of his biography later. But initially, the RSS and its vision, its malevolent vision of remaking India, he completely internalizes it, and he travels around India, catechizing for it, basically being a propagandist for it, telling people, that you're Indians. And he does it pro bono. He believes in the organization, right? He believes in its ideals. He's a true believer. And then when he comes back to Delhi, a man like Modi in Delhi, which is such a, in so many ways a fake place, people like him are destroyed in Delhi because, of his pedigree, of the fact that he doesn't speak English well. But his faith in himself makes him unassailable. He looks at these people and he knows that, so what? I may not have your pedigree, but you're a total fraud. I will beat you at this game. And he does. That's because he's a true believer. He has something to believe in. And nothing can break a man like that. And that is what... And as far as the RSS itself is concerned, I don't need to labor the point of what they believe in. I think most people here know what their beliefs are and what they believe in. And, at partition they relished the job of killing people at partition. The Muslim League did the same, but I'm not an apologist for the Muslim League. And I shouldn't be an apologist for the RSS either.
Yes, because you make that quite clear about not knowing not coming to terms with our history bit. Just digressing a bit, I was also thinking we don't know much about Hyderabad and the takeover of Hyderabad. I mean, you don't get that if you study history books in school. And Sikkim often complains that people don't know about Sikkim and how it becomes a part of the Indian Union. So that's a whole different... ignorance is across the board in that count. And so you get into one of the first big destructions, whatever we want to call it, of the Modi government was demonetization.
Yeah.
And since then, there have been doctored reports. I mean, reports have actually been doctored. I mean, fake reports, and they change their statistics and things like that. And you also get into the Gaurakshaks. I mean, these are still very fresh. I think the recounting is still very important because it kind of brings across the ugliness that both of these moments were, demonetization and the rise of the Gaurakshaks as well. But I was also, one question that has kind of always been there is, if demonetization was such a bad thing, which it obviously was, I'm not saying that it was not, is that then how does the UP election go so phenomenally in BJP's favor shortly after that? And how come it has no effect on the recent elections that we just had?
Yeah. I think there are two factors here. One, I'll just make one philosophical point here, which is that a bad decision is not sanctified because people don't punish you for it. It still is a bad decision. And the people who were victimized by that decision will still remain victims of it. Having made that point, I think in UP he won because I wasn't in UP, but people I know were covering that election. And he very skillfully played demonetization in terms Originally, do you know why demonetization was floated? It had three reasons, right? Demonetization was to combat terror, to fight black money, and then eventually it was for national security reasons. And then eventually the reason was to encourage people to go digital.
That was an afterthought.
That was an afterthought. It was an improvised effort, right? None of those targets were actually met. So he spun in UP, he depicted demonetization as a class warfare. It was, you're going to suffer. Yes, you need to put up with a bit of suffering, but that rich guy down the road, he's really going to suffer. He's going to, Shakti Kapoor is really going to suffer. And that's how he played that. And there's a strange, Raymond Aron wrote a phrase that I'm always reminded of. He said, it is a mistake to believe that people's interests will trump their passions. In the contest between what your interests are and what your passions are, your passions will always win against your interests. Demonetization was against the interests of people, but it somehow ignited the passions of people. You lost money, you lost some of your savings, life was difficult, but bloody hell, it felt good to feel that, the rich guy who's been sucking your blood for so many years, who actually is in bed with Modi, is suffering a bit more. That has a tremendous, it gives you a tremendous psychological release, psychological gratification, and we don't quite appreciate the impact of that, the effect of that.
Yes.
And that's what happened, I think, in UP. And as far as the national elections are concerned, I think people had made adjustments to their lives by then. The worst of it was behind us. And then Pulwama happened, obviously, again. Shit, I lost some money, but God, Pakistan. I would say all that demonetized money, he should send that to Imran Khan. That man gifted him the election in so many ways. And Rahul Gandhi, of course.
Yeah, Rahul Gandhi. Yeah, because it's almost, I won't call it disturbing, but the ease with which they're allowed to get away with it. Right? Just because the media does not talk enough about demonetization, it somehow just goes out of the public consciousness as well, almost when it comes to deciding the votes. And here, we've discussed Gaurakshaks and things like that, but you also mentioned Doklam, which was because it happened here, and we saw all the reporting that was happening, all based on leaks out of Delhi. As far as the rest of India is concerned, for a long time, Doklam was a part of Sikkim.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like part of Sikkim, whatever. And then you also mentioned that few people read it as a failure. Because that just was allowed to play out of the public domain. The fact that it was this really weird situation. We can discuss that some other time in more detail. But what I'm trying to get at here is that how is it that these things are allowed to just phase out? What do you think? Has the media really failed, or is it because the people don't ask enough?
I think the people can only ask questions. The reason you ask questions that you are asking about Doklam is because you had your ears to the ground and your eyes on the scene. You're a journalist. Most people absorb commentary that they read in the papers. And I think we have been failed by our media massively. Do you remember how Doklam played out? It began with Modi baring his chest to China and saying that I'm going to teach China a lesson. And everyone was saying, this man is Loh Purush. He's putting China in his place. But as soon as the Chinese said, all right, let's have this game, he disappeared from the scene. It was left to Sushma Swaraj to come in parliament and say, we've won this one. That's how it played out. And then the Chinese came back. The Indians vacated, the Chinese came back. But we never discussed it. Doklam is a success story. Let's move on from it. Let's never talk about Doklam. And the media has failed. I write about the media. The media bosses have colluded with Modi as they colluded with prior regimes. But the censorship, the fear that prevails in media houses writing against Modi. I personally have met people whose careers have suffered massively for taking on Modi. Someone like Karan Thapar, can't get a renewed contract. People... Nikhil Wagle, and you yourself would know people who probably suffered in the hands for speaking truth to power. And truth, or the true scrutiny of Modi happens in places that doesn't get disseminated far and wide in spite of the existence of Twitter, because Modi amplifies his life even better than, his adversaries do. He's good at everything you do. He's excellent.
I'm down to my last couple of questions. But this is also something I thought would be interesting to hear from you. You say that the dynamite of division that has always existed beneath the surface has never seemed so primed for detonation as it does under Modi. And should we be holding our breath? Like, when do you see this actual explosion happening?
Right.
I mean, we see enough signs already.
We're in a very interesting place to have that discussion, right? Sikkim, which, as you say, India annexed it. But one of the things India has worked for so long is because it created a supra-narrative, an umbrella identity under which all other identities could flourish and thrive. You could be a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Sikh, a Jew, a Christian, and still be Indian. You could speak any language, you could, worship any god, praise any religion, and your Indianness was not affected by any of that. India was this big tent. And that is what we call secularism. This accommodationism, this is what we call secularism, really. Our idea of secularism was not absence of religion, it was accommodationism. But when you try to redefine India in terms of Hinduism, or the ideology of Hindutva, which is not Hinduism, it's a corruption of it, why on earth should a Muslim in Kashmir view himself as Indian, if being Indian means being exclusively Hindutvavadi? Why should a Kashmiri view himself as an Indian? Why should a Buddhist view himself as an Indian? It's probably easier for a Buddhist to do that, but why should a Buddhist do it? And if, along with religion, you come with one of the ideologies of one of the tenets of Hindutva is obviously linguistic supremacy. Why should someone from Chennai or why should someone from Kerala speak Hindi? These questions have always existed in India. India is a union of dizzyingly diverse states, and we say we are Indian because Indianness never assaults our other identities. Indianness acknowledges that human beings are repositories of multifarious identities. What Modi is doing is homogenizing us, or attempting to homogenize us as if we were milk. But when you try to do that in India, the milk splits because we are so diverse. Mm-hmm. And I fear that Kashmiris, obviously now, when the curfew was lifted, will come out in great numbers, and pro-Indian leaders who said we are Indian, our accession to India is final, he's put them in jail. Yeah. They will now have to, in order to survive, in order to just show themselves in public, they will have to adopt the language of separatism. In South India, for the first time in Andhra, there are politicians who talk about the South seceding from, like MPs have talked on record about the South seceding to form a union because it's subsidizing the North. We are a rich state. We are the reason for the growth in revenues. Why should we subsidize the North, which is always talking about killing people for eating what they eat or marrying whom they want to marry? And that kind of language right now feels like, it's never going to happen. But I always think of Yugoslavia, another great multi-ethnic union, which if you were a Yugoslav in 1985, you would have thought you were the special nation eternally, going to exist eternally. By the 90s, there was no Yugoslavia, really. And I always think that Indians have this special idea. We think that we are supernaturally blessed. We are divinely ordained union. We are not. We've not known unity throughout our history. Ours is an antique culture, but unity throughout our history has been rare. It has happened very few times in our long history. We've been politically united very few times and for very short periods. So these 70 years are not the norm, they're an exception. And to remain united, we have to honor the extraordinary nationalism that was bequeathed to us by our founders. And Modi is the antithesis of that nationalism. And how can a union survive his kind of ideology? This was a union built to withstand a man like him. And now it is under his thumb. How can it survive?
Yeah, which is the other worry, really, right? This big brother has become so powerful that everyone is scared of him. And recently there was someone who commented that, what's happening in Kashmir is there in the manifesto and it's part of the ideology and things like that. But what is also a defining part of this ideology is they have problems with asymmetry. And so what this commentator had said is that he can't understand how the Chief Minister of Sikkim welcomes the abrogation of Article 370 and still believes that Article 371F is somehow safe, because you are welcoming the destruction of asymmetry. So why it's only a matter of time, or there is no permanent guarantees there. But
it's like feeding your neighbor to the tiger. And
yes, it's like it's worrying. So. I mean, this will be my final question, because I'm sure the people also have some questions for you. But you say that Modi has exhibited a disciplined outward commitment. It brings us back to Kashmir. Commitment to the norms of constitutional democracy while vandalizing the organs that secure Indian democracy. And this is in the context of Indira Gandhi, who was much more in your face with what she did. But now with the manner in which Article 370 has been abrogated, do you think that that veneer, that fig leaf that was there for some time, has finally been abandoned?
Yeah,
what happens next?
Well, he got the president's signature. He put it through Parliament, and he goes and does that Temple of Democracy thing.
Oh, yeah.
He worships the Constitution while gutting it every day. So that veneer is still there, but it's thinning every day. He's putting the paint remover every day, and very eventually, as we get accustomed to it, these things happen so incrementally that within 2 years he might get rid of 371, and we might not have the kind of process we've had this time. He might do so. Every state in the union, Kashmir is both a warning. It's a warning to the people of Kashmir that you're not immune from our power. It's also a template. It's a model for the rest of India. He can do that to Sikkim tomorrow. Who is to stop him?
Yes.
He's got the majority, and he'll use that to do as he pleases, unless there is resistance to him.
Yes, and this is not really about you not agreeing with a particular ideology. It's also because of the manner in which these institutions are being demolished. So what do you propose be done? That will be my final question.
Yeah, that's a question I'm asking myself. There are institutions which I thought would always... There was a complacency in me, and I thought the army, at its lower ranks, has always had Hindu nationalist sympathizers.
And they are like regimented.
Yeah, but at the top there was there was a genuine professionalism at the top, which has eroded significantly under Modi. Election Commission of India, which we all thought was beyond reproach, that has also changed by this. Institutions that are indispensable to the survival of India as a democratic republic are so thoroughly compromised, and being compromised repeatedly. Our only hope now is the Supreme Court. It's like we are dangling from a hill, and Supreme Court is that last hook to which our rope is tied. And how strong is it? What can we do? Can we climb back up? If that's the image, that makes sense, since we're in a mountain state.
Yeah, that is a worrying kind of... I mean, do I want that to be my only defense? It's like, again, up there for... Yeah, thanks for this.
Thank you so much.
If you have any questions, we'll do a quick round of questions from the audience. Yes, please.
When I share with you that the Congress, particularly from the 70s, late 1960s, set a path for this kind of resistance. How far are we trying to sort of, reduce all these things to individual leaders, and in the process glossing over the larger crisis in the global economy? Because something, and we might call it a shift to the right, Hindu right, or whatever it is, but essentially, there's this, the direction is looking for a messiah. One fellow talking about building a wall, there's another fellow who's talking far more vulgar things. In a country from where the Magna Carta originated, and the people flocking together. So my own kind of a suggestion would be, while the Janata they failed to govern, but it was one of those probably positive contributions of the Janata was the setting up the Mandal Commission. Okay, and subsequently it was, the 1980s was a period of that kind of a churning, and the implementation of the Mandal Commission again, it took the middle classes, those of us, the bent and the beautiful, okay? Suddenly we got shocked. No, the riffraffs are going to take this country, and hence we actually, the middle classes, led this nation to this stupid right.
Yeah.
Will that be a possible kind of a formulation? So, to take the blame rather than actually blaming it on, let's say, a Rajiv Gandhi or a Sanjay Gandhi and so on and so forth. And let's not forget one thing. If Narendra Modi is sort of, celebrating and emulating, he's emulating Indira Gandhi and Sanjay Gandhi. Okay? So, it's the middle classes that in the 90s was very articulate. Suddenly they got this Mandal Commission and they thought these fellows should not be allowed to govern. So let's actually take this nation to the right.
That's such an interesting question, for which I want to thank you, and also quite illuminating. My answer to that would be that I agree with your analysis. I don't disagree. And if I've omitted it from my own story, it's not because I don't think what you've said is important. It's because my focus, my interest was on the importance of secularism. That was my focus. And what you've mentioned is certainly a contributory factor to the evolution of India and the direction we've gone in. Now, as far as personalities are concerned and individuals are concerned, I focus on them because our politics is so heavily built around individuals. My own idea of nationalism, I look at Nehru and he's today, to me, a source of hope. And then I look at Indira Gandhi. She's almost a fall from grace. And then Sanjay Gandhi, I write a sentence in which that attachment to democracy winnowed with every generation in the Gandhi family. Indira Gandhi was indifferent to democracy. In Sanjay, there was absolutely not even any residue of affection for democracy. And the consequences were felt by Indians as a whole. You look at something like the sterilization drive, for instance. This was the idea of one man, and its effect was felt by millions of people.
And it's coming back.
Yeah, I wanted.
Are we talking population again?
Scary,
yeah.
I wanted to focus on things like that, which is not to say, that what you mentioned is not important. I think it's tremendously important, and I thank you for asking me that question.
Just two questions.
Yeah.
That's your views on it. That is, what is it, Modi or is it BJP? Modi minus BJP minus Modi. Would they have made this difference? That's number one. Number two is, was it Mr. Chidambaram's war or was it Mr. Manmohan Singh's war? Because, as you said, he's not only the worst prime minister, he was also the weakest prime minister in the entire history of India. I think even Deve Gowda was stronger than him. He stood by it. Very strong. Or I.K. Gujral, or even Chandrasekhar that way. Charan Singh, Morarji Desai, they ruled India for, they were prime ministers for a very small time, but they've left their mark. But how can we just leave out Mr. Chidambaram in this whole gamut of this one?
No, I left him out because he didn't occupy the Prime Minister's chair, but I don't disagree with your characterization of him. And the way he's going through a difficult period at the moment. The way he was arrested and taken away, I find that deeply, deeply troublesome, deeply difficult to come to terms with. There's one anecdote I want to give you about Deve Gowda because you mentioned him. He was actually, I was told by somebody very recently that India was planning to join one of the treaties that bans nuclear testing. CTBT, sorry. And there was a group that lobbied against it, and they sent him a paper, and he was sleeping throughout the meeting. But he wasn't actually sleeping, he was listening to them very carefully, and then when they rang him, he said, "No, I've read your paper carefully, we will not be signing this." So he wasn't the weakling he was made out to be. And about Manmohan Singh, I would give the lion's share of blame to Manmohan Singh and to Sonia Gandhi, because he could only have been the Prime Minister because she put him there. And there were infinitely more qualified people with mandates who could have done the job, who had some idea of what ordinary Indians, what their lives were, what their hardships were. And she put him there. And someone like Chidambaram could only flourish because Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister. He was a terribly weak Prime Minister, and Manmohan Singh could only be Prime Minister because Sonia Gandhi put him there. So I think if we're peeling the layers, we should go back to the source of the problem.
Arundhati Rai writes it as Mr. Chidambaram.
Oh, please, may I just say that please don't take me for a sympathizer of Mr. Chidambaram or an apologist for him. Everything she's written about him, I haven't read it, but I would probably endorse most of it.
I would agree with you on a lot of counts, but I don't want to monopolize the time here. I want to ask a very specific question. While we were discussing the beginning of your Modi this thing, he said that Doklam was a major failure, and then he left it to Sushma Swaraj. What I know of is that this has given a newfound spine to the rest of Southeast Asia. That to Japan also, South Korea. We've seen recently what has happened in Vietnam. I don't think I need to. The converse to that is what we have seen Philippines, what happened between Philippines and China in the mischief reef. We've also seen the A to A of the Chinese that they put into play, the second island chain, third island chain, and how the Americans have withdrawn. What do you think he did wrong by standing up to what he actually did, and by then not allowing it to boil over into a crisis which our country at that particular point in time could ill afford? Do you think he should have fallen prey to the rhetoric of the Global Times or the South China or the Morning Glory, whatever that newspaper is, and then have bitten more than he could chew?
May I answer? I would urge you to read my book, because that part about Doklam I write in great detail, and I have a lot of sympathy with the conundrum he found himself in. I'm not one of those people who believes that we should just sit by idly as China bullies its Asian neighbors. And I think it was a very difficult decision to make. What do you do when a neighbor such as China, which has already colonized, gobbled up Tibet, has dammed most of its rivers, is really a threat in the region? What do you do when it flexes its muscles? Do you just sit by? My criticism of the Prime Minister was the manner in which he handled the evolution of the crisis. For weeks, our troops were stationed in Doklam against the Chinese, facing them off. And they had fist fights with the Chinese. But they're back now. They're building that pass. They're building that road. And what the Prime Minister did when the going got tough is he disappeared from the... He was there while people were saying he's the tough guy. Exactly as you said, he's giving a spine to Southeast Asia. He was there for that phase when people were saying that. But when things got difficult, he left. And Sushma Swaraj went to Parliament, the late Sushma Swaraj, Foreign Minister, and said that Doklam was a success. I don't think it was a success. And there are people in Bhutan who now ask whether their dependency upon India is good for their future. To characterize Doklam as a success is to neglect the fact that very recently our foreign minister, our foreign secretary, travelled to China, and Brahmachalani, his foreign minister, yes, he's now a foreign minister, Jesh. Brahmachalani, who's, someone I respect very much, and someone whose work someone who I believe should have been the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, has written very critically of the Prime Minister's conduct during Doklam and afterwards. I think it is very important for India to take a stance in Asia and for democratic states. But may I just come back to one point here, which is that during the past decade, I was among those people who genuinely believed that us being a democracy, we could be a counterweight to China. Increasingly, I feel as though someone like Modi at the top of Indian politics destroys the credibility of democracy itself. How does America with Trump at the top, how does India with Modi at the top, when our internal affairs, when our minorities are lynched on the streets, when minorities feel unsafe, how can we build a counter-narrative to China? And I think I genuinely believe in India when it comes to India versus China. And I genuinely believe that we don't have, to take China's bullying lying down. We shouldn't. That's not in the interest of Asia. That's not in the interest of India. And that's not something I could ever come to terms with. But I just wish we could conduct ourselves
if you want to go up against China, be different from China, be better than China. And that's what I think. We are a democracy. We still have elections. We still have a veneer of accountability. But in so many ways, as I document in this book, we are going in a direction that destroys the credibility of that narrative of us being the democratic alternative to China. But many of the things you've said there, I don't necessarily disagree with, but I absolutely stand by my claim that, Doklam was a failure. Failure not because of what he initially did, but failure because the way he handled it. We had 13 days of ammunition. There was absolutely no preparation for it. It was improvised, like demonetization, like 370. There was absolutely no planning that went into it. That's my answer. I think we'll have to disagree.
Actually, I just want to ask you, is being strong leader or being an authoritarian, how do you discern this? And secondly, is you said that, okay, Modi's leadership is a new normal, or are you saying, because we see in liberal democracies you have very strong leaders, whether it's in Turkey today, in England, in Boris Johnson, also if you see in Philippines or in China or even in Japan, you see a very strong leaders emerging. So that doesn't mean that I actually like them to be very strong. So how do you try to reconcile this in today's so-called liberal democracies? You have very strong leaders being elected. But is it a norm or a new norm?
There is now this emerging narrative of global populism, and Modi is seen as part of that trend. I don't write about Duterte or Erdogan or Shinzo Abe, who is very different from all of them, because I think Modi is a reaction to a very specific history. I was asked this question in Delhi as well. This idea of populism, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, it's very easy we love to see trends every time. We love to see trends. But Modi, I like to look at him as isolation, because India is my country. I care about what's happening to India. Erdogan is, someone said this is a reaction to Islamophobia. Erdogan is an Islamist. He would not rise to the top if this was a reaction to Islamism. So if you put them all together, try to reconcile one with the other, I don't think it quite works. Each of them is a reaction to a specific history. In the case of Erdogan and Duterte, Erdogan was a reaction to a long Islamist struggle against a secular military rule in Turkey. Duterte, the guy who ran against Duterte, he was the son, grandson, and great-grandson, I think, of former leaders of the Philippines. And Duterte is the closest you can get to Modi. He was the get things done kind of guy, but more vulgar, not as sophisticated as Modi. So there are parallels with them, but I think when you try to create a trend by looking at all of them, I personally haven't been able to find that. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you.
Duterte is more Adityanath or something, yeah?
Duterte is like a...
Yeah, yes.
Good evening, Kapil, if I may.
Yes, please.
Welcome to Sikkim, first of all.
Yeah.
And I wish you, on behalf of everyone, I wish you a very happy stay.
Thank you.
The remainder of the stay here. On a lighter side, I just wanted to mention, as soon as Modi arrives, critics are not far behind.
Yeah.
At least in Sikkim's context.
Yeah.
We have symbolic arrival of Modi in the form of whatever the latest development that is happening here. And the critique is also here now.
Yeah.
I have two questions. Number one is, since you talked about the Modi and the RSS ideology, which is right-wing and being destructive to the democratic traits of this country, when we look back pre-Modi, the kind of dispensation that we had and the kind of policy, the policy circle, policy debates, deliberations that we have had, and the implementations also, does it not appear to be a kind of a minority appeasement? I may be controversial, but I just want to say it out. Why? Because, till that time the rule, the sanction for ruling by the electorate have not been that massive, right? So you've been on an average ruling on the virtue of having the support of say about 30 to 35% of the electorate, and then you vote and then you're ruling.
come to Modi 2014 and 2019 especially, you have a party which is, everybody agrees, it's not the BJP who have won. And it's the Modi factor, right? That's why BJP has got all this. So if you look at the mandate, it's 47 and odd percentage of the electors has given the vote. So do you not think that whatever is happening right now has the sanction of a majority of the people in this thing? So in this sense, if you look, the critique, the dissent that we are doing, is it not bigotry in the reverse happening? Number one question. Second question is, I have read reviews of this book. I have not read the book. I'll read it surely. Now in the reviews, one of the recurrent theme or the strand that I've come across is you are very polemical when it comes to your take on this, which is very obvious also today when I was listening to you, it comes out. So my second question is, being very polemical, like in one instance you also mentioned that Modi is the worst human being, forget about politician, the worst human being to be elected as a prime minister. Do you think such polemical stance in at least language presentation will help the narrative that you're trying to build? Thank you.
Thank you so much for those very interesting questions. So your first question was about bigotry in reverse against Modi. I earlier mentioned that something is not sanctified because a majority votes for it. That would be majoritarianism. That would not be democracy. And I've written this book, and the fact that it's being read and we're discussing it is a kind of homage to our democratic culture, which I fear will be destroyed. And I make that claim on the basis of what has already happened. And I cite the instances of democratic erosion in the name of an ideology, be it the seizure of institutions. I mentioned the army earlier, I mentioned the Election Commission. We look at the media, the harassment of journalists, and I cite them all. There's a chapter called Seizure in which I give a very detailed description of what has been happening to institutions. It is precisely to avert that I've written this book. And as far as bigotry in reverse is concerned, you talked about minority appeasement. I don't have a problem with that phrase, actually, because in the prologue I addressed that. You know, the idea that there is one community where women can be, abandoned by saying talaq 3 times is an affront to democracy, and that should have been got rid of a long time ago. But that was instituted for very good reasons. After partition, minorities felt genuinely, especially the Muslim minority, felt very vulnerable, and they had to be reassured as a community. But there were many perverse consequences of that, which is that, you saw the Sachar Committee report. Minorities, Muslims especially, fell behind Hindus, and that was because there were certain leaders of those communities, but ordinary people didn't really have a say. They were under the thumb of these supposed spokespersons for their communities. I'm not an apologist for any of that. I just want to distinguish myself from the classical, Indian liberal who wants to make apologies for that kind of those kinds of policies. I'm not one of those. Secondly, the polemical tone that you accuse me of, that's just my way of writing, and that's just the way I've been trained. And I've constantly been thinking that doesn't work everywhere, but sometimes I think there are times when the injustice you witness is so appalling that you can't sit there and write a 3,000-word, academic essay about it. You just have to say, that's bloody awful. And you have to say, and when I mentioned that, you mentioned the worst human being, that was from the acknowledgements. I didn't write it in the text of the book. That was because of, he went right after the Gujarat riots, and he described these refugee camps as baby-producing centres. And a man had been killed in custody, and he said, if weapons are found in the house of someone, what should I do? Should I not kill them? And all the Gujaratis roared back saying, kill them, kill them. And that's why I wrote Worst Human Being. It's not, I don't personally know him, but I certainly wouldn't vote for a man like that. I hope that answers your question. Thank you so much.
One point about obliteration of history and being ignorant about our history, which is a very valid point. In my own research, in very small ways, I've been trying to do this. I write on Hindu theology, and I've been discussing this with many fellow scholars. I don't know if you follow the work of Purushottam Agarwal. So he's a very, very important Indian thinker. He doesn't write in English, so most people don't read him. So he and I were having a very long discussion about the ignorance of Hindu history and the Hindu anxiety, which has been underplayed and ignored. And I think you used a word that the liberals have been polite in ignorance. I think I would suggest that if you could use a stronger word, the liberals haven't been polite, they've been deliberately ignorant. And the Romila Thappars have failed us very, very heavily in this, and I completely agree with you, and I'm very glad that you are writing this, and I think many of us in small and big ways, when we start talking about it, we will be making a very, very important change. I've been writing about the Ram Mandir issue from a Hindu perspective, and the last time I presented this, I've presented it in many places, but the last time I was invited to an ashram in Vrindavan, and I was very, very scared, but I went there. And I was presenting it in the company of all RSS sympathizers who are all academics, so-called academics. And I also teach, and we were all supposed to be teachers there. But I know where I was, and I know where I was standing. It was in the middle of the ashram, and I was presenting a paper on Ram Mandir. And I presented a reading of Ramcharitmanas. But when I read it from within, there was no question. Nobody could say anything, because I told them why reading the Ramcharitmanas is immensely liberating. So we've had enough of saying that Ramcharitmanas is the problem. The problem is in your hermeneutic. The problem is not in the text. And I think you have made a similar point when you talked about the temple. And it's a very, very valid point, because you said you were very upset, or you felt very insulted when you saw those idols. I think from that insult to coming to terms with it is the transition that any thinking process needs, and you have already made that point, and I just want to congratulate you for that.
Thank you so much. May I just say in response to that, I wanted to ask you if you're associated with the RSS, but that would be irrelevant, you needn't tell me. But the reason I was going to ask, I wanted to just say that, it's so good to hear that, but when I saw those temples and when, I met a professor in Delhi, I'm not going to name him, rather someone famous, a famous historian. He said he found documentary evidence of was it Babur who destroyed the temple at
Babur,
and he said he found documentary evidence linking Babur's strange glee at the destruction of the temple. But he said he'd suppressed that research, and he was proud of doing so because he was going to give ammunition. And I could understand that. I could understand his to the RSS and others, and I could understand that. And one of my tutors in England, he said to me that throughout his research, he had found so much evidence about the horrors that had been perpetrated. But he said, we can't talk about those things because these crazies will take them and attack.
We can talk about
them. And I think we should talk about them. We should find a way of talking about them. My only point is that when I walked among those ruins, I felt like they were an insult, that violence had been done to my history and our history, our collective history and heritage. I just didn't think, I just want to say, that I could ever reclaim that past by going and tearing down the nearest mosque.
Exactly.
And I think we should accept both. We should never have torn down the Babri Mosque. That was an extraordinary wrong. And I think there should be some form of restitution. An apology should be given to the community. And I don't think we honor Hinduism or any civilization or any culture by bringing down the places of worship of other people. And we should be able to do both. And if we can do that, if we can acknowledge the past and yet accept the present, then we would have arrived at this extraordinary juncture of reconciliation that might show us a path forward as Indians, as one people. Thank you so much for bringing that up.
You wanted to add something?
I just wanted to sort of, I have a slight problem with one invoking Romila Thapar to talk about medieval history. She's not, being a historian. On the contrary, somebody like Satish Chandra, who's really sort of contributed immensely to the history textbooks in school, has elaborately talked about the rapine, the destruction, and so on and so forth. It's not as if we have. Why I'm making this point is the idols were surreptitiously installed there, as explained by the then Home Minister Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel in December 1949. And yet the I mean, anything to do with this kind of a communal polarization and the kind of rioting did not take place in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. So just to sort of, I mean, suddenly it's not as if like, when people get terrified about, how their idols were destroyed only in the 1980s. I mean, these things were there. So the 1980s was a slightly different period in the larger economic context, in the larger discrediting of the Congress, and the Congress itself contributing to it. I mean, let's not forget that it was Rajiv Gandhi who laid the foundations to
campaign.
Exactly. He started his campaign talking about a Ram Rajya from Ayodhya.
Yeah.
So in some sense, like, I mean, it's not that our history textbooks did not talk about it. I mean, let's be very clear about it. Our history textbooks taught us that the medieval ages were some kind of a revanchism. History also teaches us that revanchism is not a response. So in some, let's not, I mean, Romila Thapar, she says a lot of things.
No, I'm not. I just want to.
I mean, so just bringing in Romila to talk about medieval history was a wrong option.
I think you made your point, and I just want to answer that. The Romila Thapar's name came up because I cite her while making a different argument, not Babri Mosque, a different argument, and the lady there cited her name again. So her name was mentioned twice, not in relation to Babri Mosque. Second, you've made a very specific point about Babri Mosque and its history. The conversation we were having, although Babri is the potent symbol of the Hindu nationalist desire to reclaim and revenge upon history, I was making a rather generalized point. I fear that within 15, 20, 30 years, the rage that resides in the bones of Hindus, their unresolved feelings about history, will again be exploited in places like Telangana, and BJP will profit from it. We've lost a large chunk of India to that rage. I feel that now, if we can accept history, accept what happened, and arrive at a way of acknowledging the past and moving on from it, we might save other parts of India. I really feel I met, RSS campaigners who are working on the people, on the populace, very patiently, very skillfully, very meticulously, in places like Telangana. And they will get that. We never thought that Modi was going to be Prime Minister. He's Prime Minister today. We don't think that places like Telangana, Tamil Nadu will ever fall for BJP. They might one day. And my interest is to avert that from happening, precisely because I want Indians to be one. I want my country to thrive, and I want unity to thrive. And to avert that, we must acknowledge the past. That's the argument we were making. That's the point we were trying to make. And I was very pleased that the scholar there who spoke to RSS agrees with me.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we can just go on forever, but I think there's also dinner to be had.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful experience, and thank you so much to the people of Gang Talk and this bookshop, and to Pema, and to all of you who've come. Thank you so much.